Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you are new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because today we're talking about something that silently controls countless decisions, limits potential, and creates immense suffering: fear of failure. And I am not talking about the mild nervousness everyone feels before trying something new. I am talking about the paralyzing, identity-threatening terror that stops you from even trying, that makes you play it safe to the point of stagnation, that has you procrastinating on important goals, sabotaging opportunities, or settling for less than what you want because the possibility of failing feels unbearable. Fear of failure is one of the most common but least discussed psychological barriers that keeps people stuck, and it is incredibly costly, not just because of what you do not achieve, but because of the anxiety, shame, and regret it generates. But here is what you need to understand. Fear of failure is not about the actual experience of failing, which is usually manageable and often valuable. It is about what failure means to you, about the stories you have internalized about your worth being tied to success, and about psychological wounds that make failure feel like it will destroy you. So today we are diving deep into the psychology of fear of failure, why it develops, what it is really about, how it manifests, the devastating costs it creates, and most importantly, how to work through it, so you can pursue what matters to you without being paralyzed by what might go wrong. Let us start by understanding what fear of failure actually is at a psychological level, because it is more complex than just not wanting to fail. Fear of failure, technically called achyphobia when it is severe, is an intense, persistent anxiety about failing that leads to avoidance of situations where failure is possible. But the key thing is that it is not really about the failure itself, it is about what you believe failure means about you as a person. For people with fear of failure, failing at something is not just a neutral outcome or a learning experience. It is proof of inadequacy, confirmation of unworthiness, public humiliation, loss of love or respect, or validation of the belief that you are fundamentally not good enough. Failure feels like it will expose you as a fraud, disappoint everyone who believes in you, or confirm your worst fears about yourself. So the stakes feel existential. You are not just risking failure at a task. You are risking your entire sense of self-worth and identity. This is why the fear is so powerful and why people will go to extreme lengths to avoid situations where they might fail. Now let us talk about where fear of failure comes from. Because it is not something you are born with, it is learned through experience and shaped by your environment. One major source is childhood experiences with achievement and failure. If you grew up with parents or caregivers who gave love, attention, and approval conditionally based on your performance, you learn that your worth is tied to success. If you were praised excessively for achievements but criticized or ignored when you failed, you internalize that failure makes you unlovable or unworthy. If you experienced harsh punishment, ridicule, or shame after making mistakes, you learn that failure is dangerous and must be avoided at all costs. If you had perfectionistic parents who set impossibly high standards, you learn that anything less than perfect is failure. These early experiences wire your brain to interpret failure as a threat to your survival and belonging, which activates intense fear. Another source is traumatic failure experiences, particularly public ones. If you experience significant humiliation, rejection, or consequences from a past failure, maybe you failed publicly and were mocked, or a failure led to severe punishment, or you failed at something critically important and the consequences were devastating, your brain forms a strong association between failure and danger. Now any situation that might result in failure triggers the same fear response as that original traumatic experience. There's also the role of identity and self-concept. If your entire identity is built around being successful, smart, talented, or competent, then failure becomes an existential threat. When success is how you define yourself, failure is not just a setback, it is annihilation of who you are. This is particularly common in gifted individuals, high achievers, And people who have been labeled as the smart one or the talented one throughout their lives, they have internalized that their value comes from their abilities and achievements. So any evidence that they might not be as capable as they thought threatens their core sense of self. Social and cultural factors also play a huge role. We live in a culture that glorifies success and stigmatizes failure, that treats failure as shameful rather than educational, and that constantly compares people based on achievements. Social media amplifies this by showing everyone else's successes while hiding their failures, creating the illusion that everyone except you has it all figured out. This cultural context makes failure feel socially catastrophic, not just a personal experience but a public mark of inadequacy. Let us discuss how fear of failure manifests, because it shows up in many different ways that people do not always recognize as fear. The most obvious manifestation is avoidance and procrastination. If you are terrified of failing, the safest option is to not try at all. You procrastinate on important projects because as long as you have not tried, you have not failed. You avoid applying for jobs, asking people out, starting businesses, submitting your work, or pursuing opportunities because trying means risking failure. You stay in your comfort zone where success is guaranteed or where the stakes are low. This gives you the illusion of safety, but it comes at the cost of growth, fulfillment, and achieving your actual goals. Another manifestation is perfectionism and over-preparation. Instead of avoiding entirely, you try to eliminate any possibility of failure by being absolutely perfect. You spend excessive time preparing, researching, planning, and perfecting before you will take action. You set impossibly high standards, and anything less feels like failure. This creates paralysis because you are never quite ready, never quite perfect enough, so you delay indefinitely or burn out from the unsustainable effort required to approach perfection. Fear of failure also shows up as self-sabotage. This seems counterintuitive, but sometimes people unconsciously create failure in ways they can control and explain. If you fail because you did not try hard enough, because you were dealing with other issues, or because of external circumstances, that is less threatening than failing after giving your full effort. At least you have an excuse. You can tell yourself that you could have succeeded if you really tried, which protects your self-image. This is called self-handicapping, and it is incredibly common among people with fear of failure. You might party the night before an important exam so you have an excuse if you fail. Or you might not fully commit to a relationship so you can tell yourself it did not work because you were not really invested. Another manifestation is playing small and underachieving. You choose goals that are well below your actual capabilities because if the goal is easy, failure is unlikely. You settle for less than what you want: safe jobs, convenient relationships, modest dreams, because pursuing what you actually want would involve risk of failure. Over time, this creates a life that feels small, unfulfilling, and disconnected from your true desires, but at least it is safe from failure. Fear of failure also creates intense anxiety and physical symptoms whenever you are in achievement situations. Your heart races, you feel nauseous. You cannot sleep before important events. You experience intrusive thoughts about all the ways you might fail. The anxiety can be so overwhelming that it impairs your actual performance, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where your fear of failure causes the failure you are afraid of. And there is often a harsh inner critic constantly warning you about failure, cataloging your inadequacies, and predicting doom. This critical voice is trying to protect you by preparing you for the worst and motivating you to avoid failure, but it actually increases anxiety and makes performance worse. Now let us talk about the devastating costs of fear of failure, because this fear does not keep you safe, it keeps you stuck and creates enormous suffering. The most obvious cost is missed opportunities. You do not pursue relationships, careers, creative projects, or experiences that could bring fulfillment and growth because they involve risk of failure. You look back on your life and see all the things you did not try, all the roads not taken, and the regret is often more painful than any failure could have been. there is also the cost to self-esteem and identity. When you organize your life around avoiding failure, you never get to develop genuine confidence based on facing challenges and discovering your resilience. Your self-esteem becomes fragile because it is based on avoiding tests rather than passing them. You do not really know what you are capable of because you have never pushed yourself. The anxiety and stress created by fear of failure is itself costly, living in constant worry about potential failure, managing perfectionist standards, dealing with procrastination guilt, and carrying the weight of unfulfilled potential is exhausting and takes a toll on mental health. Relationships suffer too because fear of failure can prevent you from being vulnerable, from taking risks in intimacy, from pursuing connections with people you really like because rejection feels like failure. Career and financial costs are substantial. Playing it safe usually means earning less, advancing more slowly, and missing opportunities that could transform your circumstances. And perhaps most tragically, fear of failure prevents you from discovering that you can survive failure, that failure is not actually the catastrophe you imagine, and that failure is often the pathway to growth and eventual success. You stay trapped in a fear-based reality that never gets tested or updated. So how do you actually work through fear of failure? First, and this is crucial, you need to separate your worth from your performance. This is easier said than done because if you have decades of conditioning tying your value to achievement, it requires active, ongoing work to internalize that you are inherently worthy regardless of outcomes. Therapy, particularly approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, can be invaluable for this. You need to practice unconditional self-worth, the idea that your value as a human being is not contingent on what you achieve, produce, or accomplish. Second, redefine what failure means. Instead of seeing failure as proof of inadequacy, practice seeing it as information, as a natural part of learning, as evidence that you are pushing yourself and growing. Every successful person has extensive failure in their history. The difference is how they interpret and respond to it. Work on developing what psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, where challenges and failures are opportunities to develop rather than threats to your identity. Third, practice exposure to small failures intentionally. Start taking small risks where failure is possible but the stakes are relatively low. Apply for something you probably will not get. Try a hobby you will be bad at initially. Share work that is not perfect. Have a conversation that might go awkwardly. Let yourself experience that failure is survivable, even uncomfortable. Each small failure you survive weakens the catastrophic associations your brain has made. Fourth, examine and challenge the catastrophic thoughts about failure. When you notice yourself thinking that failure will be devastating, ask yourself what would actually happen. Walk through the realistic worst-case scenario, not the catastrophic fantasy your anxiety generates. Usually you will discover that actual failure is inconvenient or disappointing but not life-ending. Fifth, focus on process over outcome. You cannot always control whether you succeed, but you can control whether you try, whether you learn, whether you show up. Shift your definition of success from outcomes to effort and growth. Did you try? Did you learn something? Did you push yourself? Those are the things within your control, and those are what actually build competence and confidence over time. Sixth, get support and perspective from others. Talk to people who have experienced failure and survived it, who can normalize the experience and show you that it does not destroy you. Work with a therapist if the fear is significantly limiting your life. Join communities of people pursuing similar goals where failure is normalized and supported rather than shameful. Seventh, practice self-compassion when you do fail. Talk to yourself the way you would talk to a good friend who failed at something, with kindness, understanding, and encouragement, rather than harsh judgment. Self-compassion does not make you weak or unmotivated. Research shows it actually increases resilience and motivation, because you are not operating from a place of fear and shame. And eighth, start taking action despite the fear. You do not need to eliminate fear of failure before you act. Courage is acting despite fear, not in the absence of fear. The fear will decrease as you accumulate evidence through experience that failure is survivable, but that evidence can only come from taking risks and sometimes failing. If this video resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might be held back by fear of failure. Drop a comment. What opportunities have you avoided because of fear of failure, or what helped you push through it? And remember, your worth is not determined by your achievements or failures. You are valuable and deserving regardless of outcomes. The life you want is on the other side of the risks you are afraid to take, and failure is not the catastrophe your fear tells you it is. It is just feedback, just a stepping stone, just part of the process of becoming who you are meant to be. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.